Hello, and today we are going to play another visual novel. This one is called 6 Days of Snow, and it is a free visual novel on Steam that I believe is about 2.5 hours, and it is about a traveler coming to stay at an inn, and from reviews, I guess he starts a relationship with a young girl. So this may be considered in the underage category, but we'll see before making any misinformed judgments. To Reiko, I hope you find your own happiness someday. The first day. It was a dark night, and the snow was falling thick and heavy beyond the windows of the car. Everything was pure white, like a saucer of milk had been upended over the earth. It looked pretty. At least, it did when observed from within the confines of the taxi, but I felt a surge of sympathy for whoever might be outside on such a night. The snow can be unforgiving, especially on a mountain like this. Why else would there be so many stories about strange, pale-skinned women that lure unsuspecting men to their icy graves? In a remote place like this, how long would it take before anybody uncovered your corpse? A day, 2 days, a whole week, perhaps a month? Being a writer, I couldn't help but ponder such morbid things, though I admit crime fiction has never been my forte. It's always been my belief that there's enough unpleasantness in real life. We hardly need to fabricate anymore. Sachiko says that's because I'm sentimental. Apparently, it's one of my better qualities. Sachiko says sentiment manifests itself in my eyes. I have unusually pale eyes. My wife has quite a way with words. I sometimes think her talents are wasted as a wife and mother, when she might have an untapped acumen for storytelling. She's certainly good at gossiping with the other women who attend art classes with her every Wednesday. Sachiko, however, always blushes and shakes her head whenever I suggest this, even as a gentle joke. She says she's more than happy looking after me and our 2 sons. Searching for any greater purpose in life would be presumptuous. I appreciate it, I suppose, but I wouldn't mind if she had a touch more ambition beyond preparing the perfect bowl of miso soup in the mornings. Not that Sachiko's miso soup is anything to be sneezed at. That was one of the things I was going to miss the most, I thought, as the car drove on through the night. Sachiko's miso soup. The miso soup at the Azami Inn would be perfectly fine, I was sure, but it wouldn't be the same. It wouldn't be Sachiko's. This might sound awfully prosaic, but when food has been prepared by the hands of a woman who loves you, and has loved you for 25 years, it acquires special properties you can't find anywhere else. Maybe that's the best definition of marital bliss. Being able to enjoy breakfast together every morning with a small, shared smile, despite not having all that much to talk about. It's a comfortable, humdrum kind of existence, I suppose. But the further I ascend into the mountains, the more it begins to slip away. With each and every mile I covered, the further away my banal life with Sachiko seemed. Soon the small details, the taste of her miso soup, the pseudo-religious watering of our much-beloved bougainvilleas, and the pervading smell of soup began to slip away. I must confess, I was not awfully sorry to be saying farewell to any of it. It wasn't that I did not care for Sachiko, because I did. I still do. We'd fallen into a rut, that was all. We had grown too accustomed to one another, and perhaps I was taking Sachiko and her miso soup for granted. It's hard to appreciate somebody when you see them every single day, and you recite the same pleasantries to them, and they repeat the same pleasantries back. It's too predictable. It would be like playing shogi, while being able to read your opponent's moves 5 turns in advance. Where's the fun in that? To put it another way, our daily routine had become far too familiar, to the extent that it was almost painful. I wasn't trying to run away from Sachiko, I told myself. That wasn't it. I just needed a change of pace. I wanted to remind myself how much my wife meant to me. I wanted to remind myself why I loved her. I was journeying away from my wife, so I could learn to miss her again, which would hopefully make our eventual reunion all the more sweeter. After giving it some thought, I decided upon the perfect location wherein I could ruminate on my marriage. That would be the snow-capped mountains of Hakuba, more than half an hour away from human civilization. There would be no people at the Izami Inn to disturb my solitude, just the snow and the stars. And that was fine by me. The young boy driving the taxicab hummed under his breath a song I did not know and tapped his fingers against the wheel. "We're almost there," he said, and turned to me and smiled. The darkness obscured much of his face, but I could see the reassuring gap-toothed grin. One of his front teeth was missing. I thought it rude to ask why, so I didn't comment, but I couldn't stop myself from fabricating stories. "How far is it now?" I asked him, hugging my trunk a little closer to my chest. Sachiko had helped me pack before my departure. I told her she needn't have bothered, but she was insistent. Despite being such a quiet, retiring woman, Sachiko could be awfully insistent upon the most mundane of things. "Not too far now," said the boy, though boy might be a touch demanding, as he must have been in his early 20s. 3 or 4 minutes, maybe 5, accounting for traffic. That was probably supposed to be a joke. We hadn't passed a single car during the journey from the train station. I must admit, I was a bit relieved. The road was so poorly lit, any oncoming cars would have spelled split disaster? I think it said split, but it should be spelled. I don't know. "It's not like you need to get there in a hurry, is it?" asked the boy. "What are you doing up near Hakuba, if you don't mind my asking?" "Oh, I don't mind at all," I said politely. "I'm a writer. I thought going somewhere remote would help me focus, generate a few ideas, that kind of thing." "Oh, an author," he whistled and sounded genuinely impressed. "Written anything I know?" "I doubt it. I'm not well known by any means, but I make enough to pay the bills." "Well, what more can a man ask for? I'm not too world-wise, but that sounds like a success story to me. Not many people who want to be authors make so much as a penny." "Ha, yes, I suppose so," I said, running a hand through my hair. "Sometimes I forget. I have a lot to be thankful for." "What kind of things do you write? Newspaper articles? Journalism?" "Some poetry. And I released a novel a couple of years ago, too." "A novel, is it?" he said, and he whistled again. "Now that is fancy. I could be ferrying around the next Ogai Mori." "Oh, I doubt I would ever reach such levels of fame. I just dabble, really." "Well, I hope you include me in your next literary effort, Mr. Tanabe Eiji." "All right, Mr. Tanabe. I'll remember that." And he nodded his head determinedly, like a chicken pecking upwards. That was a cruel simile, though, and I chastised myself for thinking such a thing. I hadn't realized it, spending so much of my life inside the city, but I could be quite a snob. That was another reason, I told myself, why going to the countryside would be good. It was always useful to see new sights and broaden my horizons, open my mind. The moon up ahead, shining in the apex of the sky like a pearl, split the swirling fog and snow with pale rays of light. In the dark, the moonlight looked lethal, ethereal. It was the kind of moon so perfectly round and full that could drive one to madness. "You better include me in your next novel, Mr. Tabane." "Tanabe," said the driver, with his distinct agape-toothed smile. And I found myself thinking that maybe I would. He wasn't a character that was easy to forget. The teeth helped. "I'm Hanada Yosuke. A pleasure to meet you." "Oh no, the pleasure is all mine," I demurred. And the young taxi driver, Yosuke, tittered. Incredible. A writer saying it's a pleasure to make my acquaintance. I never thought I'd live to see the day. He sounded so bemused by the idea, I smiled. "You know, if you really want something interesting to write about, for your next novel, of course, there's no better setting than the Azami Inn," said Yosuke, companionably, after a lull in the conversation. "It's beautiful around there. Not that I have much of an eye for it. Still, all the snow and the hills and this quaint little building out in the middle of nowhere. Very pretty." "Yes, it sounds delightful." "Lonely too, I think. But that should suit you down to the ground. A bit of peace and quiet helps stimulate the imagination, right?" "That is the general idea. All the noise in the big city can be a bit..." I searched for the correct word, but I couldn't find it. Maybe it had been stolen by the snow. "Oh, I can imagine," said Yosuke, sensing my discomfort. "I've lived around here all my life, but still, the big city, eh?" "The big city indeed. I'd love to go there once or twice, just to look around. But I don't think I could ever settle somewhere like that. From what I've heard, there are too many buildings and far too many people. I like the peace and quiet, though even I'd get a bit angsty if I had to stay in the Azami Inn for too long. I don't know how Miss Kakiuchi does it. I can't pronounce that just takes me a second. The proprietress?" "The one and the same," said Yosuke with a nod. "She's been living up there for, gosh, I don't know how long. Maybe longer than I've been alive. Because as long as there's been the Azami Inn, there's been Miss Kakiuchi. She used to run it with her husband, so maybe she wasn't too lonely before. But he's dead now. Died years ago." I looked at Yosuke, intrigued. Ideas began to grow inside my head, just like acorns sprout into proud oak trees. "What happened to Mr. Kakiuchi?" I asked, as casually as I could muster, when my efforts were probably in vain. I'd already told Yosuke I was a writer, and people never trust writers. At least they shouldn't. So this is fun because I write, although I've definitely not written a novel. That is one of my goals, though. So far I'm enjoying this. The guy, I like how he isn't the nicest person, but he recognizes his faults. And I feel like the message of this is going to be him recognizing his appreciation for his wife. But yet, I'm also troubled where it's going because of this young girl, who I assume is the proprietress's daughter. And it troubles me, too, that he has sons. And I want to know how old his sons are compared to her age. But anyways, so far, I am liking it. So hopefully, it won't be disappointing. We crowd around misery like vultures and pick the bones clean until there's nothing left. In a writing book that I listened to, I don't know, a couple months back, there was a line in there saying that you need to hurt your characters and hurt your characters some more because stories revolve around conflict, and conflict often comes down to hurting your characters. So that would be why writers would gravitate towards suffering. Yosuke, who didn't seem to be the most intelligent of people, was still sharp enough because he grinned. It was a wolfish grin, all too fitting for the large, pearly moon. "Ah, so you're interested, are you, Mr. Tanabe?" he asked. "It is an interesting story. I can't help myself. And rather well known, too. There are all kinds of stories about the Izami Inn, as I said, and Miss Kakeuchi. Not all of them are pleasant, and I don't believe half of them, but they're very interesting. I should let you know, before you continue, that I don't write crime stories." "Ah, well, more's the pity," said Yusuke with a shrug. "When you get a pretty young woman and a dead husband, there are bound to be rumors. But the truth is a lot simpler. He was old, Mr. Kakeuchi. A good 2 decades older than his wife." "Oh, interesting. So there's a parallel there, because he was 20 years older than her, too. And you know, when you're old and you live up in the mountains, chances are you'll catch a cold at some point, and you won't be able to fend off." "So he died, just like that?" "Just like that. Rather anticlimactic, all things considered. But people love talking. You can't stop them talking, even in a place like this," Yusuke smiled. "I talk enough myself. My fiancé, Hatsumi, always berates me. Still, she can't hate it that much, or she wouldn't have agreed to marry me." "You have a fiancé? Congratulations." Yusuke thanked me, smiling sheepishly. "Honestly, I feel a bit sorry for Miss Kakeuchi, all things considered. She must be awfully lonely up there without a husband, and the residents of Higashikawa aren't too keen on her either." "Doesn't she have anybody else?" "She has a daughter. Sweet little thing, Reiko. Miss Kakeuchi has always been very protective, and no wonder, after what happened to her husband." "Reiko." I nodded my head. I would have to file this away for future reference. "Doesn't she have any staff?" "Oh, she employs a few girls. My Hatsumi was one of them. But it's a small business. She doesn't get many customers, you see." "I see," I said, and I did see. I looked out the window, and I could see the hills covered in snow, with yet more snow falling, and I saw only too clearly. I couldn't imagine many people coming to the Izami Inn, not even those who were passionate about skiing. There were places to stay that were closer to the main roads, where you didn't have to hire a taxi and wend your way through the mountains for over half an hour to reach your destination. If Sachiko were here, I knew what she would say. None of this was very sensible. Still, as I wasn't a sensible man, but a sensitive one, this kind of location would, as Yusuke had said, suit me down to the ground. "I apologize for arriving so late. My train was delayed." "It's quite all right. I expect as much given all the snow," the woman, I presume was Miss Kakeuchi, replied. "I am happy to receive any customers, no matter how late they may arrive." "Business has been slow?" "What do you expect?" she asked, with a touch of wry amusement to her tone. Her voice was soft, but there was a certain bite to it, some hardness I was not able to pin down. Perhaps a touch of hardness was only to be expected, coming from a woman who had lived in this inn high up in the mountains for so very long. Had she been softer, I wondered, when her husband was still alive? I would never know. Now, Miss Kakeuchi, how can I describe her? Words failed me at the time, and they failed me even now. I suppose if I had to put a single word to it, she was beautiful. But that wasn't entirely right. She was the kind of woman who had been beautiful once. Beautiful enough to drive men to distraction. But old age had tempered some of her beauty, softening the edges to it no longer had an acute piercing effect. That was a good thing, I think. Such beauty can be used as a weapon, like an arrow. But this was an arrow whose tip had been sanded smooth. Her hair was dark and glossy, cut into a neat bob reminiscent of a kokeshi doll. It was an unusual choice for an older woman. She must have been in her 40s, but that only served to heighten my interest in her. Her eyes were the color of roasted tea leaves, and they were lined with thick, long lashes. When she blinked, her lashes fluttered in a beguiling manner that cast shadows against her face. Her skin was pale, and though there were some wrinkles around her mouth, it was unblemished, save for 2 small moles no bigger than pinheads beneath her right eye. She wore a modest kimono of muted colors and stood there regally, her hands held at her front. If looked at from afar, one could have been forgiven for thinking she was 10 or 20 years younger than she really was. But time waits for no man. At any rate, Miss Kakeuchi didn't seem to be the kind of person who steeped herself in her own nostalgia. Everything about her, from her tone of voice to the way she stood, suggested she was far too sensible to bother with such nonsense. She wasn't sentimental. Something about her posture almost seemed to defy sentiment. She wasn't like me. I suppose we were quite a poor match. In any event, I hope you enjoy your stay at the Azami Inn, said Miss Kakeuchi. It was a line she must have delivered many times, and she said it beautifully, like a skilled artisan might pluck a heart-rending melody from a koto. I must confess, I felt rather abashed. I had been imagining in my city-born and bred hubris that the folk who resided in the countryside were simpler than I, somehow. I had been wrong. I am Kakeuchi Kaio, she said, by means of making my acquaintance, though there was a certain reticence to her tone. It's nice to meet you. Likewise, I said, bowing my head. My name is Tanabe Eiji. Mr. Tanabe, Miss Kakeuchi repeated, with a small nod of her head. When she said my name, commonplace though it was, its properties seemed to change in some curious manner. European alchemists might have striven for years to turn base metals into gold, but Miss Kakeuchi had succeeded in a certain kind of thaumaturgy of her own. If you can hear that banging, I'm really sorry. That's my cat trying to get into the room. Well, if I need to introduce myself further, I have been running the Azami Inn for some 14 years, ever since the death of my husband. I'm sure Yosuke has told you about that already. He might have mentioned a thing or two, yes. You don't need to spare my feelings. I know what the people around here say. They enjoy their gossip. There's not much else to gossip about. I don't think Mr. Hanabe meant anything by it. He was just making conversation. At my expense of my dignity, I don't doubt, said Miss Kakeuchi icily. Though Yosuke hadn't said anything incriminating, I found myself feeling guilty, as if I had conspired against her. Let us move on from this subject, she said, noticing my discomfort. It is unpleasant, particularly after such a long journey. Now, Miss Kakeuchi explained the general running of the inn to me, when meals were prepared, where the hot springs were, and who to speak to if I had a complaint, while I nodded dumbly, stunned into silence. So, she said, when she had finished her short business spiel, I trust this is satisfactory? That is more than satisfactory, thank you, I said, stuttering. Why was I stuttering? Being around Miss Kakeuchi, held under the steady gaze of her dark brown eyes, had the most incredible effect upon me. I felt not like a grown man with 2 sons, but a naughty child being scolded by my father for playing too zealously about the Zelkova tree in our garden. Miss Kakeuchi was probably a few years younger than I, but she regarded me archly, like one who had been far more than I could ever imagine. I know it might sound rather harsh, but I understood immediately why the residents of the nearby village didn't like her very much. She was not a likable woman. "I shall get Reiko to show you into your room. She may as well make herself useful," said Miss Kakeuchi. With that declaration, the proprietress turned, her bobbed hair fluttering, and called out in tones that would have made an empire balk, "Reiko, we have a customer!" There was a shuffling of feet as Reiko hastened to answer her mother's call. I pictured her as skinny, uncomfortably so, with big eyes and lips pulled into a permanent frown, her head bent and her gait stumbling. But the Reiko who answered Miss Kakeuchi's summons was rather different. My imagination had betrayed me yet again. She was rather young, that much was true. Still a teenager, I supposed. And she was slim, but not in an awkward manner. Her limbs were pale and slender, and she moved like a little ballerina. "Yes, you called, Mother?" She looked just like Miss Kakeuchi did, or had done, I imagined, before old age had seen fit to sap away her youthful charms. Reiko even had a beauty mark beneath her eye, though it was located under her left, not her right. Other than that, it was an almost perfect facsimile of her mother's, like she was some kind of copy. A homunculus child raised in a glass jar. But these thoughts were rather too fanciful. "This is Mr. Tanabe," said Miss Kakeuchi, gesturing towards me. "He has recently arrived from Tokyo. Can you take his bag and show him to his room? It's the one you were preparing earlier on the west side." "Of course," said Reiko, with a small bow of her head. "I shall do it at once." She bent to pick up my bag, first brushing the sleeve of her kimono to one side when... No, that will not do." Reiko flinched at the reprimand. She was now halfway between retrieving my case and standing straight. The sleeves of her kimono were still rolled back, and I could see her arms. They were as pale as the snow that fell outside, shot through with delicate blue veins. Though I wanted to, I could not bring myself to look away. "When you are picking up luggage, Reiko, you shouldn't let your sleeves bunch up around your elbows. It's unseemly," said Miss Kakeuchi. I'm sorry." "Don't apologize," said Miss Kakeuchi coolly, "for I have told you this time and time again. Try to remember next time, please." "All right." Reiko sounded so despondent, any words of reassurance I might have thought to offer died on my tongue. I had already divined, during this most perfunctory of greetings, that her mother scolded her quite a lot. Reiko led me to my room in silence, my suitcase held in my arms. If the case was heavy for her, I did not know. She didn't slow down, and neither did she seem hampered by her burden. Her footsteps were slow and regular, like that of clockwork. Hemmed in by her kimono, she could only take short, dainty steps, right foot in front of the left, then the left in front of the right, then repeat. Tap, tap, tap. I followed along behind her like an attentive schoolboy. The wooden hallway was dimly lit, and I could hear the sound of the wind whistling outside. My footsteps made the floor creak ominously. I tried to think of things to say, but nothing sounded quite right. "The weather's awful around here, isn't it?" would have been too pedestrian. "You really do have beautiful eyes," would have been far too forthcoming. "Is your mother always like that?" would have been too personal. Despite having many things I wanted to say, I could say nothing. I didn't know why, but I wanted to talk to this girl. Maybe it was pity, because of the way she had flinched when her mother had spoken to her, and really, she must have been lonely. If Yusuke suspected Miss Kakeuchi of melancholia, then what about her daughter? Reiko's hair fluttered behind her. inky black like a veil in the darkness. But though she was small, Reiko did not tarry in her march. Instead, she continued, as quiet as a mirror and just as inscrutable. Tap, tap, tap. Even back then, I was enamored with her. Maybe it was the romance of the situation. How could you blame me? There was something very poetic about Reiko's plight, an uncommon beauty, hidden from prying eyes, lost amidst the ice and snow. Tap, tap, tap. After 20 seconds or so, though it seemed like longer, Reiko's footsteps stopped. She halted by a nondescript wooden door, much like the others that lined the hallway. "Your room," she said by means of explanation. Not that it needed explaining. I thanked her all the same and took my case from her outstretched hands. Our fingertips brushed for less than a second. If I had been a younger boy, Kenji's age perhaps, I fear I might have blushed. It's rather late, and we don't normally serve food at this time," said Reiko, addressing the floor rather than my face. "But I'm sure the cook would be more than happy to prepare something for you. Mother said you traveled a long way." "It's all right," I replied, though it had been 5 hours since I had last eaten. "I don't want to inconvenience you." "But you are our guest," said Reiko. This time she did lift her head. "Doesn't that give you the right to inconvenience us just a little? You're paying for the privilege." "Ah." I blinked. Words once more were capriciously absent. She was actually smiling. So she did not dislike me, and neither was she afraid. She couldn't have been, to joke with me so casually, for that was what it was. A joke. I couldn't stop myself from laughing. It was a small laugh, really, but then again, Reiko's smile had been rather demure. A hearty chuckle wouldn't have suited the atmosphere, and I've never been one to laugh that much. I'm too self-conscious. But Reiko made me laugh all the same. "Well, you might have a point," I said. "I suppose I wouldn't mind some green tea. I need a bit of warming up." "I know," said Reiko with a nod of her head. "It can be horribly cold around here. I hope my room has a kotatsu." "Of course. We live in the mountains. It would be a sin not to have a kotatsu. Our guests might catch their deaths of cold," she said, throwing her arms in the air for emphasis. I smiled. "Well, I wouldn't want that. I don't intend to stay here that long." Though the mountains were picturesque, I did not fancy extending my trip. "Angel, stop!" A most unfortunate side effect of death is that it tends to render people immobile, tied to one place, for the rest of their, well, not lives. "I do not blame you," said Reiko seriously. "I wouldn't stay here if I had a choice." "Which I don't." A small sigh. "Oh, well, I shouldn't say things like that. Mother would be cross with me. She'd say it was bad for business. I think things are stacked against us already, but what do I know?" "You seem to be quite knowledgeable, in my humble opinion." "Thank you," she said, with a bow of her head. Her hair fluttered, caught in a sudden draught of icy air. I knew it was because of the wind, but seized by sentimentality, I couldn't help but imagine it was because she was very full of life. Reiko was livelier by far than she had been before. The sudden contrast between her demure, trampled lily persona and the new one I was witnessing, witty, funny, and unabashedly charming, caught me off guard. Could the caterpillar have emerged from its chrysalis in a scant 5 seconds? But no, such transformation did not take place so rapidly, not in the real world. I wondered. Did Reiko's newfound freeness have anything to do, perhaps, with the absence of her mother? I'll see about that green tea. And perhaps a simple bowl of rice porridge? I think you should get something in your stomach. Do I look pecky? Reiko pretended to ponder, one hand beneath her chin. Perhaps a bit tired. Long train journeys do that, especially at my age. I wonder. I've never been on a train before, said Reiko. There was something wistful about her tone. Her eyes were misty and far away. She was so transparent, her thoughts flickered across the surface of her mind like ripples in a pool. But then Reiko shook her head and clapped her hands to the illusion, and the illusion was over. Right. Green tea, rice porridge. Feel free to make yourself at home and discover the delights of the Azami Inn. Thank you for your hospitality, I said, bowing my head. I intend to. Oh, and it's perfectly fine if you want to use the kotatsu, but make sure the fire in the brazier has burnt down before you sleep. You wouldn't want to start a fire. No, I said with a shake of my head. We wouldn't want that. Not at all, Reiko repeated. But I couldn't help but wonder. Inside her amber eyes, I swore I could see flickering flames. Reiko was as good as her word. She returned to my room momentarily, the green tea and rice porridge on a tray. They were both piping hot. She did not linger, though I would have liked to converse with her further. That would have been improper. A woman should not tarry for so long in a man's private quarters, though Reiko was not a woman, really, so much as a girl. Reiko's kimono flattened out her figure, making it nigh impossible to tell whether she had curves or not. Her age was apparent by the tone of her voice and the softness of her skin. Not that such details improved the situation. If anything, it made them worse. A woman in a man's room at night is improper enough, but a teenage girl, that is truly a source of scandal. Scandal in the eyes of the newspapers, but a sensationalist romance if transmuted by the hand of an author. It all depends on how you frame things. In any case, Reiko departed with that now familiar tap, tap, tap of her wooden sandals against the tatami mats, and I was left alone. The green tea was delicious, the leaves brewed perfectly, and the rice porridge was thick and nourishing. I enjoyed the food a good deal, though not as much as Sachiko's. Sachiko knows exactly how I prefer my tea, and she can steep the leaves in perfect accordance to my preferences, down to the last millisecond. Of course Sachiko's tea would be superior. I'd been married to her for more than 20 years. It is a most curious phenomenon, however, that men accustomed to perfection will begin to tire of it. That's interesting. So, So I don't know if this actually goes into them actually having an affair or where they maybe almost do and don't. But I find this story interesting because it seems to be about, why people end up having affairs. And I don't really know anyone personally who has had an affair. But it tends to be a thing that people, start to dislike their spouse, right? I know that people get bored, but it's usually because they don't like certain things. At least that's the impression that I get. Whereas here, it's like he likes everything about his wife, but it's boring him. And so he finds it perfect, and he doesn't really want anything else. But yet, he can't appreciate it anymore. So he needs a contrast. So through this, he'll probably then find that new appreciation for his wife and be able to rekindle the relationship, which is an interesting spin on affairs, because from that perspective, in a way, instead of breaking a relationship apart, it could make it stronger, because then you are recognizing how much you appreciate about your spouse. Anyways, is there anything more selfish than a man who cannot be satisfied? Sometimes I have to wonder. It was still snowing outside. I could see the snow in the air, falling thick and fast beyond my window. The sight of it made me feel warmer than perhaps I was, but the room was cold and seemed to bleed heat from the tatami mats. Fortunately, the kotatsu helped. Warmed both inside and out, and tired from my journey, I turned in for the night half an hour later. I think I might have dreamt about Reiko.